In this lesson, we'll take a look at the MoGraph Tracer object. So the tracer object is something that can be really useful for creating trails and other kind of tracing type effects. So for example, we have just this individual sphere, and I have this that's been run through a cloner with a random effector that's been applied to it. So basically the same setup that we've looked at in some of our earlier lessons, and I've used that to basically just introduce a little bit of random motion into these spheres. Now, what I'd like to do is actually have some sort of tails and trails that are created behind these spheres. So a perfect way to do that is through the tracer. So let's go up to MoGraph, and we'll drop in a tracer. So within this tracer, it works again a little bit differently than some of the other effectors and things that we've looked at this point. The tracer really doesn't get plugged in directly to your cloner or the object itself. Instead, you take the object that you want to trace and plug that into your tracer. So I really want it to trace all of the spheres that make up this cloner. So I'm going to take this cloner, click and drag that into the trace link of my tracer. So now if I rewind and play this back, we can actually see these little trails that get drawn back behind each one of my individual spheres. And the nice thing is that this is completely dynamic. So if I were to go back to my cloner, and let's say maybe I just wanted one sphere, you can see now it's only tracing that one object. But let's say if I had maybe a lot more, you can see it can still continue to come in and trace all of these individual spheres. So really nice capabilities here. Now if I come into my tracer, we actually do have some options to actually control this. So for example, we have right now just a global space, and right now this is set to a no limit. So it essentially means that these trails will last all the way through infinity. There really is no lifespan for these trails. But what we could do is maybe say from start, we could give this maybe 30 frames. Or maybe to be a little bit clearer, we could say something like 10 frames. Now what's happening is for the first 10 frames of our animation, we get trails. But after that, the trails stop being created. Now, I really don't want that because I still want my trails to be behind my spheres, but I really don't want them to last forever. So instead of from start, we can say from end. And now, these little tails will stick to the spheres, but once they've been in existence for about 10 frames, they'll gradually start to die off. Alright, so we can maybe come in, make those last a little bit longer if we wanted to, maybe something like 20 or 30 frames. So again, really nice features to have. Now what's really makes this nice is the fact that once these little tracers have been created, these are essentially just splines now that we could use for anything that we want. So anything that we would normally be able to use a spline for, we can now come in and use that tracer. So for example, I could come in here and make a cloner. So I'll make a second clone here. Now this cube, you may have noticed this in my scene, sort of this little green cube here. What I can do now is take that cube, drop that into my new cloner. So you can see it starts to stack that cube up. But instead of having this cube stacked up, let's actually take these cubes and have those be cloned along these tracing trails. So I can just go into my cloner, set my mode to object, and now in the object, just take my tracer, pop that in, and there we are. Now my cube has actually now been traced and cloned along that trail. So now if I were to come in and play this back, you can see just what we have here. So again, really almost endless possibilities that we can start to do with this. Another thing that we could do is maybe, if I were to disable that cloner, another option would be to, let's say maybe create a new circle. And let's say maybe instead of just having something cloned along that, maybe I actually want to have something swept along that trail. Well, I can just take my circle here. Let's bring its radius down quite a bit so that way it's nice and skinny. I can now just come in, use something like a sweep NURBS, take my circle and drop that in, and then also take my tracer, drop that in as well. Make sure that my circle is above my tracer for this to work properly. And again, there we go. Now we have these little trails that are being traced with this tracer. And again, this is now totally open for us to be able to come in and play with. So maybe if we wanted these caps to be turned off, we could do that. We could maybe come in and start to take something like the start and end scale, maybe bring that down so it's actually pinched in. And notice that my scale is actually not working properly. As I start to pinch down the end, you notice it's actually pinching that part that's closest to the sphere. But that's okay, we can come back and fix that. But we could also maybe come back to this circle. If I were to switch my camera, switch my view back to some kind of a shading mode, you can see that my wireframe is actually really dense on these tails. And that's because this circle is actually pretty high density as well. So maybe we could set this down to something a little bit lower. There we are. So that way this tail should be much more manageable. There we are. And now I can just go back to my tracer. And if I wanted to make sure that these parts of the tracer that are touching the sphere are actually the thick parts, I could just maybe come back and do this reverse sequence. There we are. So again, I can come back and see what this looks like. So you can start to see, again, some really interesting effects that we can start to create with this. And we can do this very quickly and very easily. So just as a really simple example, if I were to come in here and maybe show you something where I've built this up just a little bit more, again, the exact same technique that we've just looked at, but we can now start to come in and add things like shaders and other glow effects onto those shaders. Now with a few more of those little clones, we can start to, again, add some really interesting just abstract effects and things to just kind of populate our scenes very quickly with these sort of light streaks or whatever we might want to actually do with those. So that's a look at this tracer object. Again, very useful for creating these types of effects that are going to provide us with a lot of possibilities for creating geometry or generating clones along those streaks.